very pleased to introduce our speakers today, two preeminent British economists, John Kay and Sir Paul Collier. You may know John from his regular columns in the FT, but obviously his career spans many more endeavors. He has been working on issues related to financial economics, finance, and also economic policy. He's been involved for many years with Oxford University, although he hails from Scotland. Then we have Sir Paul Collier. His career has focused on development, institutional economics, as well as extensive work on migration, a topic that is very important for both the British policy and also probably in the future as migrations pick up, as climate changes. The book that we're discussing today is called Greed is Dead, an excellent read for any economist or a policymaker. Let me introduce myself. My name is Magdalena Polon. I'm a board member of Radix, and I'm also an economist, but I work more in the applied side of economics. I work in asset management industry, and before I worked in investment banking and IMF. And before we begin, I have to say that any views expressed on today's seminar are mine. They don't represent the views of my current or past employers, and they should not be interpreted in any way as investment advice. With that out of the way, John, why don't you start?
Thanks, Magda. The title of this book is Greed is Dead. And you may wonder why we can say that, because actually we live, as we know, in a society that is saturated in selfishness. But in the book, we talk about the way in which extreme individualism has manifested itself in exaggerated and ultimately negative and self-defeating ways. We have, on the one hand, the kind of market fundamentalism, which was summarized in the famous Gordon Gekko slogan, "Greed is good," which was, of course, simply a slight transcription of Ivan Boesky's famous, greed is all right, by the way, I want you to know that you can be greedy and still feel good about yourself. That was a culture that gripped policy from the 1980s. At the other end of, in some senses, the political spectrum, you have extremes of narcissism. There's the narcissism of the selfie, the narcissism of the activist who does not actually plan to do anything about climate change or racial justice, but attaches importance to the performative activity of, in their terms, drawing attention to it, principally by drawing attention to themselves. And of course, we have the most extraordinary display of narcissism of the modern world in the outgoing president of the United States, for whom, as for the activists, essentially, it is all about me. And what is particularly unpleasant about this kind of narcissism is that the people who exhibit it actually proclaim themselves as victims as they do it. So Trump is subject to witch hunts and frauds. The woke students of Oxford and other universities are victims of white male privilege, indeed often multiple victims of what they describe as intersectionality. And of course, you only have to stand back for a moment and realize that Donald Trump and students at elite universities are, by any possible objective standards, among the most privileged people in the world. And certainly that is not something that passes entirely unnoticed in the seats in the UK that are described as the Red Wall, the traditional Labour constituencies, which voted for Boris Johnson and his Conservatives in 2019, or the Rust Belt, which propelled Trump to the White House, and all too nearly propelled him back there a week ago. That's the story of, as we see it, of extreme narcissism, of market fundamentalism, and of greed is good, and extremes of individualism. I want to say in introduction a little bit about the implications of all of this for business. And business has been described in the second half of the 20th century by a group of economists and lawyers in terms of three complementary arguments. One is that business is described by a production function. This is an economic perspective here, that output is a function of capital and labor. Capital and labor are substitutes for each other. And if you double the amounts of capital and labor you supply, you more or less double the amount of output. A bit more, a bit less, maybe. Secondly, business is a nexus of contracts. This is a legal perspective that says business is, the corporation is a legal fiction. It's an economical device by which the group of individuals who get together to construct a car or whatever it might be, find it convenient to make contracts not directly with each other, but through the firm. And that takes you to the legal doctrine of corporate personality, but it emphasizes that the firm is essentially a description for a collection of individuals. And then the problem of managing the firm reduces to one very largely of motivating these individuals to some kind of common purpose, which is typically the maximization of shareholder value. And thirdly, having defined the firm in these two initial ways, as a production function, as a nexus of contracts, then the definition of the firm is the collection of assets, the K in the production function, to which the workers, the L in the production function, turn up every Monday morning. If you read that literature, and it's an extensive literature constructed from just after the Second World War to the end of the last century, you will see these complementary aspects to it. And the easiest way to read it is to remember that they're talking about General Motors. A very high proportion of this literature is actually quite explicitly talking about General Motors, but General Motors is the representative of corporation, and even if it isn't explicitly about General Motors, it is implicitly describing General Motors. And indeed, all the elements which I've described essentially did describe General Motors. The trouble was that by the end of the century, we knew that General Motors wasn't even very good at making cars anymore. And it certainly wasn't as good at making cars as other car manufacturers that took a rather more inclusive and less instrumental view of the nature of their business. Instead of the nexus of contracts, they were a group of people working together, and to the extent that there were contracts at all, they were relational contracts in which people formed relationships with each other, worked problems out, and attempted to see what they could make happen together. If one looks at modern business, the Apples and Amazons and the like, you find very difficult to describe them as production functions consisting of capital and labor. If you double the inputs to Apple, you wouldn't double the output. It's not very clear what you would get, in fact. And indeed, modern businesses have almost no K. If you look at the balance sheets of, say, Apple or Amazon or any of these dominant 21st century companies, you will discover that their operating assets, firstly, they're very small. Secondly, that they don't need to be owned by the company that uses them, and mostly they aren't. So when you pass a warehouse that says Amazon on the side, you should know that Amazon operates there, but it's very unlikely that Amazon actually owns it. So business isn't described in this way by capital anymore. It's not, none of these stories, narratives that were descriptive of 20th century business help us in understanding the businesses that are dominating the global economy today. But the misleading description which I've described has, I believe, done a great deal of damage. And I'd emphasize two ways in which it's done that damage. One is it's delegitimized business. So we now have the extraordinary situation in which Google and Facebook have 2 billion customers each, more than any company in history could ever have imagined having making sales to. But actually one hardly needs to pick up any newspaper to discover some vilification of these giant companies. And they're certainly not by any standards the worst behaved or the most hated companies in the business sector today. If one wants to look at these, one needs to look at some of the financial businesses or some of the pharmaceutical businesses that are run by people who framed as their objectives not just making profits for the shareholders, but actually in a world of excessive individualism, of making a great deal of money for the individuals who ran them. And that's been a large part of the story of business from the 1980s through the financial crisis, and I fear beyond. Let me stop there on that rather gloomy note and pass over to Paul to describe the problems that have arisen on the side of place.
Thanks, John. I should say it was John who had the idea that we should both write Greed is Dead. We agreed in a restaurant, and the reason John thought it was a good idea to team up was that just as he'd done Radical Uncertainty, I'd just done a little book called The Future of Capitalism. When you introduce the purpose of Radix, Magdalena, I was reminded that the opening chapter of The Future of Capitalism ends with the pitch, the future, I want to explore the future of ethical capitalism, welcome to the hard center. And so it's trying to build a center which is purposive and confident, instead of a center which cringes between strident and noisy extremes. And so we need a confident center. So John's discussed the ludicrous reduction of firms to nexus of contracts, and basically the firm was nothing but a cipher for individuals under incentive contracts, and that's obviously a nonsense. And I want to turn now to the same in respect to place. And in a lot of modern individualist thinking, a place is just a random collection of the individuals in it, who need have no larger existence than this random collection of individuals. Places matter. Those individuals who think of themselves as unattached to place describe themselves as anywhere people, in contrast to the people who bond to some place. But the anywhere people turn out to be surprisingly particular about where they are happy being anywhere. In Britain, they're happy in being anywhere as long as it's London, Oxford, Cambridge, or Edinburgh. And frankly, that's about it. In America, they're happy as long as it's the big coastal cities or Chicago. So for anywheres, they're surprisingly particular about somewhere. Meanwhile, it's evident that places are fundamental to the to understanding widening inequalities, because the big inequalities are to a considerable extent spatial. And we see that most dramatically in America and Britain. And the most dramatic measure of all is life expectancy. Life expectancy in Britain, if you move 100 miles from Oxford, you can get to a place where life expectancy on average is 10 years shorter. That's an astounding difference within a very short distance. That's life expectancy. But if we look at the changes in life expectancy, it's even more dramatic. Technology is increasing life expectancy around the world by an average of about 2.5 years a decade. That's wonderful. Right? Wonderful. My kids might live until they're 150 or 200. It's amazing, right? Well, life expectancy in the left behind places in America is falling and has been falling for 20 years. And that is now true of a lot of the left behind places in Britain, falling life expectancy. It doesn't come much more dramatic than that. Massive failures in space-based, place-based public policies that reverse a technological possibility of 2.5 years extra per decade into actually falling life expectancy in some places. So places matter, but it's not just health. It's also productivity. And in Britain, again, it's very, very extreme. In London, average productivity of the workforce is about 74% higher than in the rest of England and Wales. That's a massive difference, right? And 40 years ago, it was very much narrower. This is a difference which, until 1980, for 200 years, spatial differences in productivity have been narrowing. And for 40 years, they've been widening. Right? Not only that, we now know from very recent research that divergence has been accelerating since the financial crash. And we've just discovered why it happened. And it wasn't technology. It wasn't fundamental forces of the productivity of agglomerations. It was a consequence, a direct consequence of the financial crash. As a result of the financial crash, finance became much more fearful and so moved into less risky things. And that meant spatially go into to buy assets in the centers of the big cities and move out of the smaller places. And so that risk aversion post 2008 has actually amplified it. And there's an amplifier in the amplification, because if you've invested in a skyscraper in central London, then the value of that skyscraper and its land has gone up, and all the activities that own space there have stronger collateral in raising money for their ventures. And so at the moment, 2/3 of the venture capital finance in Britain is concentrated in London and the Southeast, which even now are only 23% of the economy, but the venture capital is building the future economy. And the future economy, 2/3 of it, is going to be in the Southeast unless we're careful. So the spatial divergence will widen. So place matters enormously, and we have just neglected it because of this focus on the individual. And so the anywheres have cheerfully said place doesn't matter, whilst themselves congregating in the places that do matter. I grew up in Sheffield, which was a steel town which was broken in the early 1980s. And I moved to London, and a lot of people like me grew up in places that are now broken and have moved to places like London. And we're doing very well, but we're very conscious that the people we've left behind are not doing so well. So on that note, that's what's gone wrong in the places. John's talked about what's gone wrong in the companies. Now let's look forward. because Greed is Dead is ultimately a hopeful book. It's saying it doesn't have to be like this. I'm going to pass it back to John. You're mute, John.
Yes, can you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Right. I began with the point Paul has just ended on, which is to say that we adopted this title, Greed is Dead, not to say that there was no longer offensive, unpleasant greed in our societies. There plainly is. But to say that as an intellectual doctrine, the kind of ideas which were based on that have run well past their sell-by date. And actually, one of the intriguing things for us in the course of this year has been the positive cascade of books that have adopted different versions of this similar theme. That one started in the early spring with the religious perspective on all of this, with Rabbi Sachs' book on morality. We wrote about it as economists. We just have Michael Spence-Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit from a philosophical point of view. Just in the last couple of weeks, there's been the publication of Robert Putnam's new book, The Upswing. I've mentioned already Joe Henrich's work. There was, and he has just produced, I can never get my head around the title of it, but something like The Weirdest People in the World, with a lengthy subtitle to follow. And we even have, for those of you in Holland, your own Rutger Bregman, who has, of course, published his book on how people are pretty decent recently. The interesting thing about this is every one of these authors or groups of authors comes from a different perspective, and yet every one of them comes to similar conclusions about what it is that has gone wrong in our society and towards what needs to be done to put it right. And at the same time, this volume of literature is actually part of what certainly Paul and I see as a change in the direction of social sciences. Again, we have a cluster of books from different perspectives. I've mentioned Joe Henrich's The Weirdest People in the World. The predecessor for that 4 years ago was The Secret of Our Success, which is not a self-help manual, but is a very intriguing explanation of how the prosperity which we've come to take for granted in the Western world is the product of what he describes as collective intelligence. We have Nicholas Christakis, who in an incredibly wide-ranging canvas has spelled out the way in which cultural and genetic evolution have shaped our society, with the emphasis on prosociality, which is at the heart of it. And we have Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber from a decision theory point of view, who've talked about communicative rationality and the way in which what we describe as rationality is not the economist's conception of rationality as the behavior of individuals optimizing, but it's actually how we communicate with each other. If we take all these things together, we need to start thinking about our economies in a rather different way. And if I can focus on some of the issues of business, corporate personality is not actually a legal fiction. Corporate personality in the modern corporation is real. And even in the old corporation, it was real. If you went to Shell or Unilever or ICI 50 years ago, you went to an organization that had a clear and distinctive corporate personality. If you went to Marks and Spencer as a management trainee, you might not like it, but if you did like it, then after the first 2 years, you were basically there for life. These organizations were never nexuses of contracts. They were groups of people to work together with well understood relations between them. Equally, a firm is not a collection of assets. As I've already described, the valuable modern corporations today are not valuable by virtue of the physical assets they own. These are incredibly unimportant aspect of their business. And if you visit either a Google office or an Apple store, you will first of all immediately realize that there is, on the one hand, a distinctive corporate personality there. And on the other hand, if you do a little bit of research, you will go, before you go, you will discover that Google doesn't own the office and Amazon doesn't own the shop. In fact, rather amusingly, the Apple store in Regent Street, which is their European flagship, is jointly owned by the Queen and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's, I'm afraid, the nature of modern capitalism. And of course, these businesses aren't described by production functions of capital and labor and substitution between them, and a process of scaling up to get double the outcome. Modern business simply isn't like General Motors anymore. And as I said earlier, General Motors wasn't in the long run even very successful at being General Motors. If we have what would be the iconic complex manufacturing product of our time, which would be something like an Airbus, we come straight up against the remarkable fact, which is in a way at the center of Joe Henry's argument, which is that there is nobody, literally nobody in the world who knows how to build an Airbus, but yet 10,000 people working together do. And together with a few thousand other people bringing their own capabilities to bear on it, you can fly that Airbus from London to Sydney. So business isn't described by these historic reductionist individualistic models. Successful business is essentially a community of people working together with a common purpose. And we need to recognize that, talk about business in these terms, in doing so, re-legitimize business, and understand why so many of the iconic businesses of the 20th century, from General Motors to ICI to Marks and Spencer's, why so many of them failed to make it effectively into the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me pick up on that and talk about place again. So John has pivoted from firms as a nexus of contracts between individuals to communities of work with a common purpose and capacities that are distributed across their teams. And now I want to say it's exactly like that with places. Places are not random collections of individuals. They are communities of place. And it's the communitarian aspect which makes them so successful. It's the interdependence between people. Not the fact that, why is London productive? It's not productive just because a lot of very, very clever individually people happen to be in the same place. They're productive because they are all together. They are dependent on each other. And that dependence, that interdependence, raises the common productivity above the level that could be attained by those individuals on their own. So if you distributed those same people all around the country randomly, their productivity would be much lower. Let me turn to a community of place that is a big community, but very successful. And that is Denmark. And the whole place, Denmark is a series of communities, but it's a community of communities as well. And we see that because Denmark has been really good at repeatedly generating common purposes. How does a community generate common purposes? Through dialogue. It's a peer-to-peer process. Dialogue is not a super smart person at the top dictating to people down below what they should do and then monitoring them and incentivizing them. Dialogue, let me give you an analogy. It's like playing ping pong. Peer-to-peer, under agreed rules about a common purpose, in that case, having a game. It's not on in ping pong to win the game by picking up your bat, going around the table and hitting your opponent on the head. Right? You're working towards some common purpose around an agreed framework of rules. Denmark's got so good at that that that's why on virtually every measure of per capita income, well-being, happiness, and so forth, longevity, they come out at or near the top. And they've got so used to building that common purpose that when a new one suddenly came along, the nightmare of COVID, a very modest leader, with not particularly educated, not at all. She's a single mother who's had to struggle to bring up her kids. But when she said we, she wasn't the commander-in-chief issuing orders, she was the communicator-in-chief who everybody listened to. And so here was a new common purpose. We've got to contain COVID, otherwise an awful lot of people will die. And so she worked out the blindingly obvious thing. The first thing you need to know about this is whether you personally have got COVID, in which case the only way we can do that is mass testing. How do we do mass testing? Decentralize it across the country, which they did. And then, if you've got COVID, protect your neighbor. Don't give it to them. If you're an old guy like me, stay out of the way of the young people so that they can get on with their lives. So, how did that play out? Very, very low rates of COVID. No upsurge in the beginning, no upsurge now. They were able to reopen schools very early. And so not only have young people not missed education, the hit to the economy has been very modest compared to a place like Britain, which has had both high mortality and a big hit to the economy. So that's common purpose applied to common obligations in a place. How do you apply that in Britain? With great difficulty, because we're dealing now with places in Britain outside the magic circle of London and Edinburgh and places, which are like upside down dinghies. They've stabilized into a dysfunctional local equilibrium. Everything is dependent on everything else in a place, but there's a whole syndrome of failures. For example, there are very few skilled jobs, and so there are very few skilled workers. And so there's very little facilities for training. And so families don't want their kids to get training, because if they get training, they'll leave the place and they'll leave the family. And so we're in a syndrome of low skill and low productivity. In Britain, the answer which New Labour came up with about 15 years ago was put the north of England on Benefit's feet. And that's because in this individualistic world, it saw people as primarily consumers. And so what they needed was more money. Whereas what people need is the dignity of being able to be productive so that they can contribute to common purposes. It's what St. Michael Sandel calls contributive justice. Everybody needs to be in a position to be able to contribute to the whole. We know how to do it. We know it's perfectly feasible. Western Germany has widely distributed productivity. Switzerland has very widely distributed skill. What is difficult is turning an upside down dinghy the right way up again. And that depends upon a coordination between businesses discovering or rediscovering their obligations to communities, and universities rediscovering their obligations to the communities they're living in, and so forth. So getting the upside down dinghy to become right way up is hard. That's what I'm now working on with a team. But we know once it's the right way up, these places will be very much happier. And we know that they're so angered by being upside down that they've mutinied. That's why we've seen the mutinies like Brexit. Brexit was a mutiny against London, not against Brussels. So on that note, let me pass back to Magdalena.
Yes, thank you both, Paul and John. We are getting quite a lot of questions already from the audience, and I think some of them relate to what would be the practical steps to stop that vicious cycle in the local communities. And I think especially for you, Paul, given your also experience with institutional economics and development economics and your work with some of the African economies, can we derive any conclusions from that work you have done with developing economies and apply it to the UK? And maybe later, John, if you could comment on this because of your very seminal work on the role of the financial sector in your well-known report, what would be the steps from the side of the financial sector in that rebuilding of the local economies?
Okay, let me take the first question, and obviously John will take the second. So, what are the insights from working on very poor countries that we can apply to the task of levelling up poor places? A couple of years ago, I teamed up with Tim Besley, who's Britain's most revered academic economist at the moment at the London School of Economics, and we worked together on what could be done in very poor and fragile countries. And that's a report you can all download. It's called Escaping the Fragility Trap. Because we saw that these countries like Mali, Afghanistan, South Sudan, etc., were stuck in this syndrome of interdependent problems. So it was no good looking for what was the prime cause of fragility. Whatever had been the cause, what was happening was a trap of these interdependent problems. And how did you get out of it? And so we came up with a strategy. I'm going to describe it to you in brief because Tim Besley emailed me a couple of weeks ago. We're working together now on the levelling up problem in Britain. How do you cover poor regions? And he said, it's weird, it's uncanny that analytically it's identical to the work we did 2 years ago on these most fragile states. So what's our strategy for, as it were, turning the dinghy upright in a fragile state? And it says, it's no good just focusing on the long term. Of course, it takes a long term to get the dinghy upright. But in places that are broken, if you don't focus on the short term, you never get to the long term. And so it's a step-by-step process. And we also learned from radical uncertainty and said, do we know how to turn Afghanistan into a prosperous society? No. What's more, nobody does. And so you have to start with a set of feasible things you can do given the constraints in that society. All the constraints always have to be met. That's the big failure with IMF and World Bank programs of reform in these countries. They start from what's wrong, here's the ideal, and then they say, get going. Everything's wrong in these societies.
And so, in terms of practical steps for the UK?
I'm sorry?
In terms of practical steps for the UK, you talk a lot about, you use Stoke as one of the examples of those communities that have that got forgotten. Yeah. What would be those practical steps to straighten up that dinghy of Stoke?
We're working with 3 of the regional mayors already. So the first thing is use a coherent economic geography entity, and the right entity is a region. If you just look at an individual locality, the first instinct of the mayor is to say, our problem is the city next door gets more than we do. As soon as I arrived in Swansea, the first thing that I heard from people in Swansea was, our problem's Cardiff. Well, no, the whole of South Wales has got to be developed together, right? So you need to move to a large enough entity. Britain's only just done that with the regional mayors. Then you come up with a common strategy for the region, not we telling them what to do. The first thing we tell them is nobody knows what to do, including you and including us. But let's work together with local business, with local civil society to do something that, given the context of this place, looks a sensible start. And then let's monitor it and work out step by step as we go. We'll need to adjust. The big, powerful lesson of radical uncertainty is, if nobody knows, first learn from others. And so we're studying all the turnarounds, successful turnarounds in American and continental Europe, and there are lots of them. And secondly, you learn from experiment, which you monitor step by step. Expect to have to adjust things. So that's the lessons.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think I would like to come back to this idea of learning from the experience of other countries, because the UK experience seems to be somewhat different from the experience of continental Europe. But let's move to John and talk about the role of finance and the financial sector in restoring communities. John, you're on mute again.
We're going to be talking about almost the same thing as Paul. I'm going to be talking about almost the same thing as Paul has just been talking about. I mean, Paul has put on the table the theme of radical uncertainty. Some of you may have heard me talk about radical uncertainty a month or so ago, which was the theme of my previous book, as Paul mentioned. And the answer to radical uncertainty is not to find people who claim to know, either to be able to predict the future or to describe it with probability distributions. It's to understand how little you actually know, and that the way you learn is by decentralization and small-scale experiment, together with honest feedback that enables you to respond to the results of these. So the starting point is decentralization, both of political authority and of finance within the UK. And we can't address these issues seriously unless we start tackling these. Now, Paul has, some of you may have picked up the issue that is raised by the way Paul is framing this, which is, I think he must be absolutely right. There is no way to move ahead other than to start decentralizing power to the regional authorities that are already existing, such as the regional authorities in Manchester and Merseyside and in West Midlands and Yorkshire. But actually, one realizes that is not the totality of the problem, because the interesting thing about, we mentioned Stoke, Magdalena, the interesting thing about that 2019 election was that the dramatically lost seats for the Labour Party were actually not in the big cities. The most deprived constituencies in the UK are actually in the centre of Birmingham and Liverpool, respectively. And these are also the safest Labour seats in the UK. The places where the mutiny has occurred were in places like Stoke and Don Valley and Northwest Durham. And in looking at that, one realizes that isn't just about, the problem isn't just about inequality. These are not prosperous places, but they're not deprived places either. They have relatively high employment levels, but the employment is, the community aspect of employment has largely disappeared. Don Valley used to be a coal mining area. Consett used to be a steel making centre in Northwest Durham. Stoke used to be a ceramics centre. Nowadays, the largest industry in Consett is making caravans. The largest industry in Don Valley is almost certainly warehousing. Doncaster is a major logistics centre now, and there are no less than 4 Amazon warehouses there. Depressingly, the largest employer in Stoke today is Bet365, the online gambling service. It's not just a matter of providing work or a matter of money, it's providing work that is associated with pride in the business you're engaged in and pride in place. So we need to decentralize both political authority and finance in ways that actually enable these places to begin to regain the kind of self-confidence which there once was and which has now been so clearly lost. And work and place issues go absolutely together in that kind of regeneration.
Thank you, John. And thank you for bringing back also the topic of radical uncertainty. For me as an economist, that's one of obviously the topic of the day. And I kept the introductions short today intentionally, because if I was to mention all the books that the two of you have written, it would have probably taken the whole seminar. But let me focus on two topics here. One is how do we go forward in terms of formulating economic policy in that more communitarian spirit that you're arguing for? And the other question will be slightly more theoretical, because obviously you want to reject the economic theory based on the economic man. What would we replace the economic man with, and how would we approach to theoretical economics using different assumptions?
If I can pick up, Magdalena, your second question first, to say what I think one of the exciting things I've been discovering in the last decade is that most of what I've learned about economics has been derived not from reading works of economics or works by economists, but by reading works that people have been developing in other social sciences. And I listed some of these earlier, getting insights from anthropology, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and the like. And I think we can find a very different story there, which enables us to understand that humans are actually hardwired to be both cooperative and competitive. And whether we're talking about successful businesses or successful economies, success is the story of harnessing both these cooperative and competitive instincts to general benefit rather than to general destruction. And Paul will illustrate from his own experience in Africa how the problem in so many of these states is that both these instincts to cooperation and to competition are deployed in counterproductive ways, that you have business that is opportunistic rather than competitive, and you have politics which is about what's in it for me or my tribe, rather than about any conception of public good. Similarly, in relation to firms, in the end, what went wrong in these major financial businesses that fell apart in 2008 was that they were destroyed in the end by the greed of their own employees. That since there was no reason to work in these firms other than to make as much money as possible for yourself, that was what people in these businesses did until the businesses themselves collapsed under the weight of that individual greed and selfishness. You know, Bear Stearns was the company that famously had the sign saying, "We make nothing but money." And the final outcome of the business that made nothing but money was that they turned out not to make that either.
Yeah, let me pick up on that a little bit. So what's the alternative to economic man? I think what the rest of social science broadly interpreted is telling us is that the pertinent entity is actually the bonded group. If you like, we start from a social community, not an individual. We start from a social community with a collective mind and a capacity to learn and imagine and innovate. And the problem as John sketched, Africa's full of bonded communities. The tragedy is that they're all small, and it doesn't have bonded communities at the big level. It's not like Denmark, which has little communities that then add up to a big community. And so typically, not exclusively, but typically in Africa, you've got bonded groups which compete. And what are they now competing for? This big new pot called the state. And so there's literally the working phrase in Africa is it's our turn to eat, mainly meaning we've got hold of the state now. And so we're going to beat it for our own purposes. So that's terrible. So I think that the sort of the right working concept going forward is what I call adaptive societies, which is communities of communities, so that they're able to function. The basic entity is this very decentralized power of decision, which John talks about. And so you get a lot of parallel innovation, a very dynamic society. It's very adaptive, but it's able to have common purpose at a very high level. And let me very briefly turn to your other question, Magdalena, which is, what's the way forward, given where we are, especially in the spatial divergence? And the answer, I think, is pilots. We need some we're dealing with all the time with Whitehall, and Whitehall is trapped. And the trap is that it will not decentralize because it says local government has no capacity. And the reason local government has no capacity is that because it's never decentralized, it's never needed any capacity, nor has it got the money to build any. And so what we need to do is concentrate some resources in a few pilot places, concentrates training and retraining and upskilling of staff and putting new staff in, so that we can get a few successful turnarounds, which then get properly monitored. And those monitored pilots then persuade Whitehall, we can safely follow a different approach. Otherwise, we're stuck with the upside down dinghies.
Yeah, I guess on that, you also have successful examples from a number of transition economies that have introduced local reforms and have managed to build not only the economic power of these local communities, but also rebuild the civic society after years of communist rule. We are getting quite a lot of questions also from the audience. Some of that relates to the centralization of the power in Britain. Why is Britain so unique in being a highly centralized country? What are the roots of that high centralization? Is it just the political history of the UK, or is it more of a way of thinking of the British government?
Well, I'll get started on that, John, give you time to think. But it didn't always used to be like that. Britain used to be much more decentralized, both financially. Banking's always starts local, because that's where the knowledge is. That's where the information is. So all the British banks were banks, which then got merged by the Bank of England around 1900. So when I grew up, there were only 5 banks, all in London. So the finance industry is way too concentrated now. It didn't used to be. And as government became much, much more powerful during the 20th century, all that power got concentrated in London. So in the 19th century, power was much more widely distributed in government around the country. So you get massive centralization during the 20th century, both in finance and in government. And now Britain is this absurdly joint public, and everything happens in London. And it's very hard to break out of that. As I said, the finance industry is just pumping more and more economic growth into the southeast, and the London civil servants often are barely conscious of what is going on in the provinces, and so this is why between them and the political order, for 40 years, divergence proceeded very rapidly with nothing done about it. But let me hand to John.
I'll offer a slightly different set of answers. Why is finance so concentrated? I think in large part the answer is not just that we, from the beginning of the 20th century, as Paul has said, we concentrated banking into a rather small number of very large businesses, because these businesses for most of the 20th century continued to be rather decentralized. They had regional offices, they had local branches and the like. That changed really because on the one hand, technology made it less necessary to appear to have local capability. And on the other, we had the removal in the 1980s of the factors that siloed banks, which enabled, it's paradoxical in the first instance, retail banks took over investment banks, but then one got the converse, that the people who took over retail banks were the people who had come up on the investment banking side and ran these banks in very different and ultimately more destructive ways than the decentralized retail bankers had done. I remember and have said quite often that when I was a schoolboy in Edinburgh in the 1960s, joining the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland was a career for the boys who weren't going to get good enough jobs to go to good universities. And they would, if they kept their noses clean, spend 40 years with a bank and rise up a bank hierarchy before retiring on a decent pension. The paradox, of course, is that these banks were subsequently run by very clever people with first-class degrees and MBAs who ran them not only worse, but much, much worse than their predecessors, who were my schoolboy contemporaries. But actually, that's a story of finance. In relation to why Britain is so centralized, I'll offer a rather speculative grand theme economic explanation, which is that in the 19th century, there were very big economies of scale to being a country, because being a Western country involved maintaining and developing a colonial empire. And the larger you were, the more effective you were at doing that. So you had, Britain was always a unitary state, so was France, and they were joined with the reunification of Germany, the unification of Italy and so on, by larger states which attempted to rival these. In the 20th century, these advantages have turned round. We realize that being a big state and attempting to go and beat up your neighbors is not such a good idea as it once seemed to be, that maintaining a colonial empire gives you far more problems than it gives you economic benefits. So while the number of countries in the world in one century diminished, it's increased rapidly in the 20th century. And I think that's one of Denmark, since we keep coming back to that country's advantages, for reasons largely to do with proximity to powerful larger countries. It actually eventually gave up imperial ambitions and decided wisely to stay small. And that creates a decentralized, socially cohesive state that we now have there. But that's a rather large piece of speculation in all of this.
Thank you. We're getting some comments from the viewers that your proposals may be too focused on cities, and as a result, the other areas like the countryside may fall behind. I will second that. I grew up in the countryside, so we should not forget that part. I'd like to ask you: are you idealists? People are greedy after all, so. Isn't it better to just channel that greed into something more productive in a better way, rather than trying to finish it off altogether?
I'm going to have a go at that first, and then John will come up with one of those killer answers like he just did. Look, we're not saints. We are mammals. and all other mammals are greedy, selfish, and if they get the chance, lazy.
I'm very disappointed your cat is not there, because the cat features prominently in the book.
Indeed, Catus economicus grisou, yes, who is all of these things, yes. So we are a mammal, but we're a very, very distinctive form of mammal. And this you don't have to take from me, you take it from the evolutionary biologists of the highest caliber. They say we're an astonishingly different mammal. We're pro-social, we're imaginative and dynamic. We want to get the good opinion of others in our community. And so we're an amazingly distinctive, unusual mammal. And so we're betwixt saints and sinners. Of course, we're a bit greedy and a bit lazy and a bit selfish. If you say that's all we are, that is a total travesty. And it's unfortunately, that's what we teach economics students, and we now know that there's evidence that it actually makes them more like that, which is a disgrace, right? A disgrace that economists seem to be quite proud of. Similarly, we've built institutions which are run on the assumption that people are greedy, lazy, and selfish. This top-down, the smart guy that John was describing, who he knows best, and his problem is how to get these greedy, lazy, selfish people to work. And so he monitors and incentivizes them. And that strips people of agency and so reduces them in dignity. They no longer have the agency to be moral actors. Everybody is capable of being morally load-bearing, and we need organizations and institutions which give people the opportunities to be morally load-bearing. So we're not saints. I think saints are a bloody nuisance. Right? They posture around setting the bar unrealistically high and make it discourage everybody else from trying. So we don't need posturing saints. They're a menace. But we need to recognize that we're not just catus economicus, though we can be reduced to it.
Can't overestimate that point, that people, as Paul says, are not saints. But the reason humans dominate the planet is that humans are social animals who are able to work together for cooperative purposes. I've always treasured the comment by Mike Tomasello, the primatologist, who says, no one ever saw two chimpanzees carrying a log together. And if you think about that for a moment, you start to realize how fundamental the difference is between us as a species and actually the species to which we are most closely related actually are. And they're the reasons why, in terms of what we would regard as productive enterprise, chimpanzees have accomplished nothing, and we have accomplished, for good or bad, all the things which we have done in our societies. It's why, starting from the proposition that we're all individually selfish people, all out to maximize something, and all we need to do is find out what it is we're maximizing and create carrots and sticks round about that, gets things entirely from the wrong end and leads, as Paul has been describing, to institutions which, because they're built around the assumption that people are selfish, actually aggravate that selfish and self-interested behavior. And that is actually the lesson of the failures of businesses in the financial crisis, and the lesson of the failures of many other businesses as well.
Thank you to both. I think one last question is, what took so long to recognize the costs, not only the dangers, but the actual economic and life lost cost of extreme individualism? And do you think that as we now go, and I have to raise the topic, as we now go through the coronavirus pandemic, do you think we can shift public thinking more towards that communitarian spirit? And maybe it's only just generational, with the younger generation actually being more focused on more communitarian approach.
Want to take that? Start that.
I'm happy to start, but I thought it was a gift for you. But let me start with what took us so long. What took us so long? Our political parties, both at the left and the right, became unrepresentative. They started to represent the people who were successful, whether they were left inclined or right inclined, and the successful people were living in successful places. Remember, everywhere people live very much somewhere that isn't a left behind place. And so I think the reason things were neglected was that the political process just massively underrepresented the people and places who've been left behind. And so it was only when things got so bad that they mutinied that we suddenly started to notice. And then once we noticed, as John said, there's this tidal wave of stuff coming through. So let me quickly answer COVID, and then I'm going to pass to John again, who'll give much better answers than I will. But COVID can push societies both ways. In Denmark, a communitarian place already, they've now very rapidly demonstrated how communitarianism works. New Zealand's the same. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, also a young woman, has described behavior for COVID as, what are we doing? We're a team of 5 million. A team of 5 million. We've all got moral responsibilities. We've all got a common purpose, and we've all got to do things. Both of them hugely successful in dealing with COVID. You go to America, and a very individualistic society. What was the response to COVID? Queues outside gun shops. Is this protect your neighbor? No, it's shoot your neighbor. Does it work? No. They've got a very, very high incidence of COVID and a big economic hit. So, so COVID can amplify communitarianism and can also, unfortunately, amplify individualism. But let me pass to John.
I'll give you a personal answer to what took so long, which is I spent first 20 years of my career teaching and trying to contribute to standard economics paradigms that were based on rational choice and optimization. It was when I went out into the world of business and discovered that businesses didn't seem to be maximizing profits. I scratched my head for a bit and thought they weren't maximizing profits. What were they maximizing? And then I came to realize that most people in most places aren't maximizing anything. Most people are trying to cope with a radically uncertain world which they don't properly understand and can't fully understand. And that has changed my thinking fundamentally since then. And I hope that thinking in that kind of way will help other people change their thinking fundamentally as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, indeed. The economy of society is a complex system. So a shock first may test the limits of the system and then push it in the unknown direction. And also thank you, John, for bringing the interdisciplinary side to our discussion. And a number of books you mentioned, I think one of them I read recently, The Enigma of Reason, is a highly informative book, and I think would help many economists and policymakers understand the limits to our own know-it-all attitude. Thank you so much, both of you. Before we move back to our host, I highly recommend the book. I read a lot of econ writing every day for my job, so I try not to read too much economics in my free time, but this was an excellent read. Brought me back into my university years when I was consuming economic literature with massive hunger and amazement. So that was an excellent read and highly recommend that. Now